Thank you very much. My paper is a little different, particularly because I don't have a PowerPoint. So at least you get to have the lights on, and there's no danger of you nodding off since we've already been going for a long time. But I have looked at regulations and also considerations that apply across domains like normative measures and so forth, and what is there really out there. And we've heard over the last 2 days an awful lot about the concerns that exist. I mean, the technical, the ethical, the political, the social, the cultural issues that arise, and so forth. We've talked about liability, about accountability, algorithmic explainability, and so forth. And what I find really interesting is that particularly in the last 3 years, I think this debate has really highlighted the concerns that the public also has, and that is by way of the 2016 election in the United States, and also by all of the media manipulation and the chatbots and all of these issues that are ricocheting around. And that is something that has really focused the public mind on what is out there and what does it mean, and what does AI really mean for us. And what we see is that we now have concerns about the facial recognition, and I will come to this a little bit. In India, it's led to lynchings, for example. We've seen a recent event in Sri Lanka where actually social media was cut for 2 weeks, precisely because of the danger that there would be deaths, because there was the bombing of the mosques, as you have probably heard. I'm sure you have heard. And so now there are a lot of questions that are coming up about the social platforms, and those are really not easy answers that we need to find. And I want to take stock of some of the attempts to regulate AI and technology, and I also make the comment that this paper outdates very quickly because you can always add to it, and even in the few weeks since I wrote this, it's been changed. I have one item in my paper which I will not spend as much time on, but I took it as an example of having a single focus issue on AI. And my point of that is really that it's easier to focus on one issue and use that as a model for regulation, or at least for one regulation, rather than surveying the whole gamut of ideas. And that one single issue was curbing lethal autonomous weapon systems. I'm very grateful to Bruce for having spent some time also on this, and we discussed it over lunch. But this is an issue that has been going on since 2013, 2014 first, when it was discussed in a meeting of member states in Geneva. And in the 6 years that I followed this, and I've written other papers on it, so if you're interested in it, I'll send them to you, it has actually regressed. It has actually regressed to the effect that there's been a lot of time spent on definitions, what do we mean, and these weapons don't exist yet, et cetera, to the effect that now you have 28 member states that are advocating for a ban on them. You have 3 member states that have said we want to negotiate an agreement to ban them, and you have other member states that are saying absolutely not, and that is basically the US, the UK, Israel, Russia, China, and a few other ones, but those are the most outspoken ones. Now, what I find interesting in this is because it's also been picked up in capitals, in parliaments basically. The Lords Select Committee on AI in the UK challenged the UK's futuristic definitions of autonomous weapon system and said it was clearly out of step. Then they were with those of the rest of the world, and they demanded, the parliamentary committee, that the UK's position be changed to align these within a few months. Now, interestingly enough, the government's response was limited to 1 paragraph, and that stated that the Minister of Defense, and I quote, has no plans to change the definition of autonomous system, and noted that the UK will actively participate in these meetings, which of course are not going anywhere. But I find it very, very interesting that basically there was absolutely no response, and I'll come back to the UK at a little bit later. Now, the European Commission also issued a communication last year, April, so about a year ago, with a blueprint of artificial intelligence for Europe, and it does not specifically refer to laws, but it demands an appropriate ethical and legal framework which is based on the EU's values and in line with the Charter of the Fundamental Rights of the Union. And then the European Parliament adopted a resolution last July which asked for very urgent negotiations of an international ban on weapons systems that lack human control over the use of force. I find it interesting because when you follow this, you really have never heard of these things. I mean, you've never heard that there's been a demand by Parliament and what actually has happened to it. Federica Mogherini weighed in September of this year. But in any case, to me, it means that the issue of autonomous weapons has really raised the profile of legislating AI And of course, there's a lot of advocacy around this also by civil society group. And that comes to the question, can we ever hope to regulate and govern AI? And as I said, it's easier to address one issue than a very broad definition or a very broad adaptive across a range of cognitive tasks that we're looking at. And I think that when we have difficulties in looking for the question, because we know now it's already used by public agencies, it's very much used in criminal justice systems, in predictive policing, college admissions, we've all followed the matter of these scandals that have recently arisen, and in hiring decisions and many more. And then you ask yourself, are these really appropriate? Is the use of these automated decision systems appropriate? Should they be used in particularly sensitive domains or not? And how can we assess the impact? And then whose interest do they really serve? So those are really many of the questions that are in. And what is difficult about it is that there's a lack of transparency. We've all heard about the black box. We don't really know how these decisions are arrived at. And so it's outside of understanding, it's outside of scrutiny, and it's outside of accountability. And, but on the other hand, we all know that algorithms are endowed with specific structuring functions, and they're designed by individuals. I mean, they're not necessarily made by robots, so we know that. But I think that basically we have had a number of cases in the US that I'm aware of that has given rise to several lawsuits that prove that decision-making formulas were corrupt due to data entry errors and biased historical data. And this shows the limits of AI use in public policy, but it is clear to me that lawsuits set precedent in law, but they cannot establish regulations and the rule of law. But on the other hand, AI-driven technology has been important for people and for governments, and there are two distinct trends that I am looking at. First of all, the AI in the tech industry has really become a hub for ethics advisory boards and related efforts. To me, this is kind of buffing their credentials in terms of saying, we do responsible AI. There are private organizations that have been established, like Partnership of AI, OpenAI. Academic institutions have come in. New York University have set up institutes like AI Now. Massachusetts Institute of Technology has a project on AI ethics and governance. There can be many more that can be cited. I mean, they've really proliferated, in particular in the last maybe 5 years. Also workshops and conferences with a range of tech and non-tech stakeholders. We're having one here. Now also debating the challenges as well as exploring solutions. Now what has really happened is that governments are also stepping up. And this is the second trend that I wanted to highlight because it focuses on the disruptions by artificial intelligence and the search for shaping the ethics of AI. We have all heard the statement, for example, by Putin, right? He did this in, he sort of said that whoever controls AI will control the world. He made it to school children, but it kind of reverberated all around, you know, the newspapers. And then in 2017, China issued a blueprint. And I'm sure that some of you have looked at this, or all of you have looked at it. And it basically said, we will rule AI by 2030. We will be the leader in AI by 2030. And when you look at this, and I think it was about 85, 90 pages, but the plan barely mentions information on laws, regulations, and ethical norms. I think it was less than half a page. There's nothing in there when you look at this. Now, China is not as hampered by the values and the fundamental rights that maybe those of us sitting in this room are. But on the other hand, I think that in the 2 years since its publication, China is already starting to overtake the US as a leader in AI. When you look at patents that are issued, when you look at the number of papers that are being published, it's really pretty amazing of what is happening there. And I see some of you nodding there. You're clearly aware of this. French President Macron called last year the technological revolution that comes with AI, in fact, a political resolution. And he said that in shaping how AI would affect us, you have to be involved in the design stage and I emphasize, set the rules. Very important. And actually in 2017, in December, there's a French data protection agency, the Commission nationale de l'informatique et des libertés. They had already issued the results of a public debate about AI algorithms, actually a bit ahead of the curve than some other countries, which I thought was important. I'm not going to tell you exactly what's in there because it takes too much time. But on the other hand, the recommendations in the report primarily focus on the individual, by saying that we need more education, we need more information, but it also requested private industry to focus on ethics by establishing committees and an ethics code of conduct on ethics charter. And again, coming back to the UK, the House of Lords Select Committee on Artificial Intelligence, and they issued a report a year ago in April, so saying, AI in the UK, ready, willing, and able. You know, really very catchy title, I find, when you kind of look at this. And it was based on extensive consultations and has an assessment of the current state of affairs, but also numerous recommendations on living with AI and on shaping AI, which I thought was important. 183 pages, and it has 2 paragraphs on regulations and regulators. And what do these 2 paragraphs of 183 pages say? They say that blanket AI-specific regulation at this stage would be inappropriate. I'm going to skip some of all this. Very interesting what they say. But then, in the final paragraphs, the report also refers to the preparation of ethical codes of conduct by many organizations, and sort of says there should be a cross-sectoral ethical code of conduct suitable for implementation, etc., etc. Nothing specific, very generalistic, recommendations that came out of it. Now, in June 2018, 3 months later, the government had a 42-page response to this large report. And there is in this paragraph 386 of the report of the House of Lords, the meaning no blanket AI-specific regulation needed. The government agreed with the recommendation. It said that it's committed to work with businesses to develop an agile approach to regulation, etc., etc. But basically, nothing really happened. They set up a Center for Data Ethics in response, but the Center for Data Ethics, which I think only started working a couple of months ago, I think it only has had 1 meeting established late last year, it only has an advisory function promoting best practices and advising how government should address potential gaps in the regulatory landscape. So that was basically a response to a very, very meaty report, even though there wasn't very much. Other issues, very quickly. Sweden published a report in May 2018 at a very digestible 12 pages. And it highlights the government's goals to develop standards and principles, etc. Nothing happened so far that I'm aware of. Finland, a bit ahead of the curve, already had a report in 2017, but none of the 8 proposals that are in the Finnish report deal with rules and regulations. Germany issued a 12-point strategy, and that focuses on making vast troves of data available to German researchers and developments, improve conditions for entrepreneurs, stop the brain drain, etc. But it very heavily emphasizes the rights and advantages of AI for the citizens and underlines the anchoring and ethical and legal of AI in Europe. Now, we have now the European Union, and that, of course, in April 2018, issued AI for Europe, Embracing Change, and that was the launch of this European initiative on AI, had 3 separate aims, and they had ambitious plans, both in financial terms and in deliverables and the timelines end of 2020. Now, let me just mention what I find very interesting about the GDPR, which came into force last year, but markets, any company that markets goods and services to EU residents, regardless of its location, is subject also to the regulation. I don't know if all of you were aware of it, but I think it's a very important mean, because what it doesn't mean is it will have a global effect. Now, one of the deliverables of this was the independent high-level expert group of artificial intelligence, which was asked to draft AI ethics guidelines. We got Aimé and we got Stefano, who were members. I was a reserve member, attended some meetings. And anyway, I find this a very important effort. And we have not quite seen the end of it, but nearly, because the draft guidelines were issued in December, received over 500 comments. And then Paolo, you already mentioned the ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI, which came out last month. So again, I'm going to skip over that. And they're now in a pilot phase, if I understand correctly, and will be issued in the summer and then implemented by next year, which I think is very which I think is very ambitious. Now, the other issue that I find interesting in this context is that the EU Commission wants to bring their approach to ethics to the global stage. And they're saying, because technologies, data, and algorithms know no borders. In the G7 summit in Canada in December last year, AI was prominently featured. And the EU wants to strengthen cooperation, they said, with other, quote, like-minded countries like Canada, Japan, and Singapore, but also with international organizations and initiatives like the G20 to advance the AI ethics agenda. There was, when it comes to the EU guidelines, there was an article in the paper, and then Stefano and I discussed it because it was rather, let's say, critical. And he said, well, he said, I don't know about this person who is a very respected German philosopher, because he said he never brought this to the fore at the meetings. I know that it was brought up by myself in one of the meetings, and it wasn't, so it resonated with me. But then again, I don't want to spend time on it, and let's stand it for what it is. Now, it thinks that the EU ethics guidelines, the jury is still out, but the criticisms of major tech companies and academic ethics board, especially in the US, is very strong. And when you look at companies like Microsoft, Facebook, and Exxon, which make stun guns and body cameras for police departments, all of them now have ethics advisory boards on the issue. Amazon recently announced it is helping fund research into algorithmic fairness. And Salesforce employs an architect for ethical AI practice, as well as chief ethical and human use officer. Now, clearly, there's a field out there for those of us who are interested in working on this issue, because people are hiring. But then, is it really to head off government regulations? I mean, one wonders, is it a fig leaf, or is it something positive? And I think ethical, the other criticism that one could have is that the boards, which have been established, seem to mirror real-world inequality. Frankly, mostly white men, very few women, few or no people of color or minorities, or they have members who do not represent ethical values. And as an example, I want to cite the establishment of an ethics board by Google, which they actually called not ethics, but Advanced Technology External Advisory Council, quite a mouthful, that lasted barely a week before it was disbanded among great controversy. So the Google debate actually shows that getting these discussions into the public eye invites public scrutiny. And I think that that is, again, very healthy. And I find it positive that private industry is studying these issues and inviting views in company ethics. Ultimately, who takes the decision is the CEO, and he or she gets to decide which suggestions on ethics would be incorporated into what are essentially business decisions. The bottom line is very important. And as I think Bruce was talking about, the millions and billions of money that is being earned with these issues, that's really, where the rubber hits the road. So the issue revolves around accountability, and government regulation, in my view, will be needed to enforce it. I'm a little bit at a loss because I don't quite know how many minutes. Is this 2:27 that I have still? Okay, fine. Now, the other issue, very quickly to focus on, is the facial recognition technology, FRT, used widely already. Facebook, millions of users posting photographs. In China, I understand there are 176 million CCTV cameras. And it is some positive aspects, like reuniting missing children with parents, particularly in India, but protecting privacy is a major issue. But this is an industry that is expected to bring in more than $10 billion in the next few years. And the lack of governmental oversight is really quite amazing. It's because it's very stealthy. Now, what we had just 2 days ago is that San Francisco actually put out a ban on facial recognition technology, which I find quite amazing that they took this. I mean, San Francisco being the hub of the tech industry, right? So I find this incredible. And I think containing FDR is easier in Europe, where strict privacy laws are being enforced. But for example, you learn that the musician Taylor Swift deployed facial recognition technology during one of her performances because she was afraid of stalkers. Now that really shows you how deep embedded this is already in. Now, the other issue I wanted to mention is that there was a Turing Award that has been given to 3 preeminent computing scientists for their work on neural networks, and that actually accelerated the development of face recognition services, and they, together with 24 prominent AI researchers, actually signed a letter to Amazon asking it to stop selling the facial recognition technology, which is called Rekognition with a K, and to law enforcement agencies because, not because it was illegal, but because it was biased against women and people of color. Now, coming back to this, could there be a role for international organizations institution? Very briefly, Antonio Guterres, Secretary General, weighed in on AI in July 2018 and basically said that he wanted to have a forum to look at this. It's a forum that he wanted a global dialogue. It was Melinda Gates and Jack Ma as co-chairs, 18 additional members, expected to submit its report by July. Identifies policy, research, and information gaps and makes proposals. But on the other hand, having served in the UN for a long time, I also know that very often this is very broad, needs to accommodate a lot of views from different regions, different constituencies, and it's not always very implementable, if I can call it that. But on the other hand, I think it is good that this is being looked at. Now, I have recommendations coming up, recommendations that I wanted to be very concrete as to what could be done. I have 15 of them. I won't read them all. You can look at them in the paper. But I think there are a couple of issues, and I just want to highlight 3 or 4 of them that are very important. I think there needs to be found a common language for government officials, policymakers, technical experts, the public. There needs to be more education of the public, because right now it's probably confined to a rather narrow segment of the information. I think it also needs to be discussed how to build a social license for AI, new incentive structures to encourage governments and private industry to align the development and deployment of AI technologies with the public interest. And I also think one needs to focus on outcome and not process. Very often it's always focused on process. And then establish some red lines, so no-go areas for AI technology, whether it's the lethal autonomous weapon systems, AI-supported assessment of citizens by the government, like the social scoring, etc., that we all know about. So those are just 3 or 4 of the items that I find very important. I have more on them because I think that it's really important to focus on some practical issues and also maybe some cross-cutting issues like you had suggested. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent.